I've been sort of imagining this idea of a DAO of DAOs, which is sort of like a meta structure wherein different DAOs sort of like specialize and do one thing, but then there's like a meta structure on top of them.
How do we know the state and like the well-being of nature or the living world in such a way that's credible and durable that can inform economics, policy, law?
If you're literally socially entangled with the people that you're living with on the ground, and especially as we head towards a quite scary potential civilization collapse type moment, I think the value of the networks and the friendships and relationships and the reputation, etc., that you built up in those networks is going to become extremely valuable.
So in your case, you will say, for instance, that ReFi DAO is a community?
A network society, we kind of call it.
Network society?
And then participating within...
Which is part of a larger network nation.
The larger Regen Network Nation or Regen Nation or Regen Coordination or Regen Commons, whatever.
Welcome back to the Network Nations mini-series on the Greenpill podcast. I'm Primavera De Filippi, and together with Felix Beer, I will be your co-host in the coming episodes. Today, we are witnessing across the world new kinds of civic communities, which are beginning to take shape. Communities that use decentralized technologies to govern themselves, to steward shared resources, but also to act together collectively across borders. And this is what we call network nations. And so in this series, we explore network nation as a new design space for civil society in the network age. Our goal is to chart an alternative path to the network state, one where technology is at the service of civil society and not the other way around. And so instead of reproducing today's power imbalances in the network age, we are asking a few questions. What if network societies were built from the bottom up as shared commons, rather from the top down as a startup venture? And what if they treated members as co-creators rather than as customers? What if they practice cooperation and mutual care rather than competition and extraction? And what if they cultivated sovereignty as a collective good for the many, rather than as a private asset only owned by a few? And so, in each episode, we will bring together thinkers, builders, and organizers, practitioners, who are exploring this new frontier of community self-governance, helping us imagine how civil society can reclaim political agency in the network age. And if you want to dive deeper, please go and visit our website, networknations.network, where you will find our manifesto and many other ways to connect with our growing community of practice. Today, we're exploring how the regenerative finance movement, which we usually refer to as ReFi or Regen, might help understand what is a network nation. Because when we look at this movement through the network nation lens, we see globally distributed communities united through a shared identity as regions, as well as new emerging self-governance systems. And so we want to explore whether Regen can be regarded at least as a proto-network nation. And to do so, we're joined by three pioneering voices in the regenerative movement. Kevin Owocki is the founder of Gitcoin and Greenpill, and is one of the key architects of the regenerative Web3 ecosystem. Through Gitcoin, Kevin has helped channel over $50 million to public good, and through Greenpill, he's cultivated the cultural and mimetic foundation that unite the global Regen community. Austin Wagemuth is the Chief Regeneration Officer of Regen Network, which is building blockchain infrastructure for ecological regeneration. The work of Austin is to bridge the gap between digital coordination tools and real-world environmental impact in order to help create systems that reward generative practices. And then Monty Merlin is a co-founder of ReFi DAO, which has become one of a key coordination layer for the regenerative finance movement. And through ReFi DAO, Monty has been helping to weave together the diverse projects and communities working towards planetary regeneration. And so together, we will explore how those different initiatives are creating new forms of shared identity, self-governance, and collective actions. And we will try to understand what the Regen movement can teach us about building network nation that serves both the people and the planet. Cool. So thank you everyone for being here. It's a pleasure to have the three of you together. So to start with, I would love if like each one of you taking like maximum 5 minutes, if you can each present like what is the story of your initiative, of your community, like what sparked it, like what was the initial incentive to create it, and also what was the process that has led to it becoming what it is today and the aspiration that you have for it.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Yeah, so I'm Austin. I'm the executive director at Regen Foundation, which is the nonprofit arm of a broader project called the Regen Network. To give some like context and story about how the project came into being, it began initially around like 2017, around a community of permaculturalists and regenerative practitioners that were interested in leveraging decentralized technologies to further a core ambition of like humans and planet living in symbiosis and in synergy, and inherited a legacy of like regenerative enterprise from some thinking by consultant and kind of philosopher Carol Sanford around like regenerative economics more broadly, and applying that to Web3 technology and human environmental stewardship. I would say that the Regen Network, like the problem space that I think united the project initially, I would roughly describe as this question of like ecological state protocols, which is how do we know the state and like the well-being of nature or the living world in such a way that's credible and durable that can inform economics, policy, law, and that maybe blockchains and Web3 have this incredible opportunity to create this sort of distributed sense-making apparatus where people can actually take the pulse of the planet and not just rely on some institutional or centralized actor to broker that, but create networks where we're able to sense the planet and have it inform different systems. So that ecological state protocol premise, I think, is like really baked in, and a lot of people are very interested in sort of this core question within Web3 of how can we create like genuine distributed knowledge production around the state of the planet. And that has thus created this cascade of other questions around creating different kinds of like financial instruments and governance models around the protocols that create value. I'd say like maybe one other kind of core interesting aspect that unites a lot of the philosophy of Regen Network is this idea of thinking in graphs, where the data model and the underlying structure is meant to be that different inputs and attestations into this larger network begin to compound and reinforce one another to create this sort of collective intelligence, like a networked model of understanding that is dramatically enabled through distributed ledgers and things like that. So this sort of like creating decentralized graphs has been this really important and underlying interest within the regen scene. And I guess in order to develop a protocol and an infrastructure layer that's able to achieve that and to be substantial and effective, like governance at different scales has become like this sort of central question, whether it's governance at a protocol level around token economics or different like software level upgrades, all the way to like the lowest level of land stewards and like environmental guardians. How do they budget in a participatory way? How do they make collective decisions? Practice informed consent. So the governance space as a form of commons has been one of the kind of driving consequences of this original idea. So I particularly work a lot in that space of governance in this mode of like commons that are both like land stewards, protecting the physical planet, and also the commons in a digital form, like knowledge commons, data commons, and things like that. So yeah, that's like Regen Network in a 2-second intro.
Amazing. Cool. Kevin, you want to go next?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm Kevin Owocki. I'm one of the founders of Gitcoin, as well as the author of Greenpill. So just a brief revisiting of those two projects. Gitcoin is a crowdfunding platform, protocol community that's about funding what matters to your Web3 community. we've hosted 23 rounds of funding, and close to $70 million worth of funding has gone through Gitcoin, mostly towards open source software, but also have done things like community education, climate, biodiversity, bioregionalism, Ethereum localism. And during COVID, we had people 3D printing masks in places where centralized facilities couldn't actually produce them, and I think actually even saving some lives with those 3D printed masks. And so yeah, we're about funding what matters, and that's deliberately vague. That means that people that are using Gitcoin can decide what matters to them and then use quadratic funding in order to distribute that capital. We're now doing more than just quadratic funding, and Gitcoin 3.0 is on the horizon, and so we're evolving into a new structure in the future, and I can get into that if you guys are interested in that. But yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to creating regenerative culture, the primary venture that I've been working on is Greenpill, which started in 2022 as a book, a vibe book that I self-published, and actually kind of like wrote it in like a fit of inspiration over December 2021, the holiday. And basically, what I wanted to do was I wanted to articulate the vision of how we can use coordination technology to solve coordination failures. So there's all sorts of coordination failures in the world, things like climate change, things like not funding our open source software. A contemporary one that people love to talk about is like AI alignment. That's a coordination failure if it doesn't work out. And so I wanted to talk about how we can use the coordination technology in order to solve the coordination failures. And I also wanted to carve out a little bit of a niche in crypto that was for other people like me who cared about making social progress. I felt like at the time there wasn't really like a community for that. It felt like crypto had these very strong like libertarian leanings and very strong financialized leanings, and I wanted to create a place where we could gather around social progress and progressive things, but without invoking sort of like a culture war. Like it's a bridging institution insofar as I think we understand libertarianism and we understand the need for finance, and we're not like like rejecting those things, but it's just a place where we can focus on social progress. And so Green Pill was published in 2022, and then I turned it into a podcast with the help of my friends at Bankless. Thank you, David Hoffman, for helping me get the Green Pill podcast off the ground. I think episode 1 was Vitalik, and it was really cool to have his endorsement of sort of like regen/green pill as an important part of the Ethereum ethos, or like maybe a component of it. I know that Vitalik cares a lot about what he calls public goods, and public goods funding and making sure that public goods are funding is an example of solving coordination failures, in my opinion. So yeah, Greenpill then grew into greenpill.network, which is a Discord and Telegram community of people who organize chapters all over the world and are practicing this kind of work locally, running summits in places like India or places like Portland. And it's been really neat to see this sort of like grow into, I was calling it for a little while, Bankless calls their audience the Bankless Nation. And so just as a shitpost, I started calling the Greenpill audience the Coordination. And that was a fun little mimetic chapter, but it's really grown into hundreds of people who care about this set of values. And I'd say that those are my co-conspirators, the first people I go to whenever I have an RFP or things that I want to work on with Gitcoin. And yeah, I think that through that's probably how I met Monty and started to be working with Monty. So maybe I'll hand it off to Monty at this point.
Nice. Yeah, let's do it. I'm super excited and grateful to be here with you guys, and all you've all done for the space has been awesome. And yeah, happy to give a bit of background on ReFi DAO as well. So we kind of started ReFi DAO in the bull market era of 2021, when there was all this hype coming into this newly formed ReFi space, as KlimaDAO and Toucan Protocol managed to tokenize carbon and suddenly bring 10 to 15% of the entire global carbon markets on chain in a matter of months. And suddenly, Regen Network had been doing stuff for a while, but this kind of ReFi acronym was born, and many more people, projects, capital started kind of pouring into the space. And so we really started ReFi DAO to try and be this kind of shelling point or supportive kind of movement to nurture and grow and support this movement that was kind of bubbling up in this space. And so we, did things like founder circles. We have the ReFi podcast, and also funded and supported a whole network of events across the globe with ReFi Spring, doing all this kind of stuff in the early days. And then really, as things kind of evolved and matured, and there became this lot of hype around Balaji's book around the network state, how to start a country. And we kind of realized that a lot of the pieces that we'd started building with ReFi DAO, the online community, but also these real life events kind of, fitted into this framework in some ways. And so we kind of, evolved this model of ReFi local nodes and really, leaning into local communities across the globe who are taking these tools and technologies that are being built in the crypto space and actually implementing them in the real world to solve real problems. And of course, we were, riding that network state hype a little bit, but also there was some really deep resonance in some parts of it, looking at traditional systems and nation states that are so clearly, fundamentally broken in a lot of ways with the climate breakdown, polycrisis, meta crisis, all of these coordination failures that Kevin is talking to. And so, this idea of building something entirely new, globally distributed systems and starting a new kind of state almost, it appealed quite a lot. But then thinking about it a bit deeper, peeling back some of the layers, obviously, shout out Primavera to your podcast series that you did with Josh, Overthrowing the Network State, sort of really started to peel back the deeper ideological underpinnings of Balaji and the network state kind of movement and realize that actually maybe statehood and territorial sovereignty isn't what we need here, and that maybe we can still acquire, regenerate land, and do this kind of coordinating and interfacing with some of the existing states and institutions. So really we kind of pivoted away from this network state framing and recently we started a regen coordination, kind of leaning into that and bringing in other networks like ReFi DAO, but also, Greenpill network, the Salo regional DAOs, Bloom, the BioFi community, Ethereum localism, to see can we kind of pull together and start building these new institutional structures that coordinate and align these many awesome communities and projects across the globe. So that's really been my focus and the kind of evolution of ReFi DAO from network state to regen coordination. And I know obviously it's not coordination anymore, it's network nation. So here we are.
The name change every once in a while. So amazing. So basically the three of you are here on this podcast for a particular reason, which is we started analyzing like which are the proto network nation that we can identify in the space. And there is this constant coming back to this thing, which unfortunately we don't have a name. Maybe by the end of this podcast we can find a name for it. But this kind of like there seems to be something building up in the Web3, but also beyond the Web3, of like a particular community of communities or network of networks, which is aiming to this like aspiring for a particular future way, which is using technology or leveraging technology in order to promote regeneration and sustainability at the planetary scale. And so your three projects, I think, are perhaps like very like pillars in this, but there is obviously many more. And so what I'm curious to hear from you is like, do you perceive this kind of like you being part of a larger network? And if you were to try and describe what this larger network is, independently of its names, like how would you describe it?
I've been sort of imagining this idea of a DAO of DAOs, which is sort of like a meta structure wherein different DAOs sort of like specialize and do one thing, but then there's like a meta structure on top of them through which they coordinate, share resources, and because they're specialized, rely on each other's services. Maybe the most tangible example of this is Monty, us working together. It feels like I almost feel like Greenpill and like there's not a lot of like boundaries or like ego around who owns what in the work that we do together, and we've kind of been reaching across the aisle and building the movement together more recently. So it feels like that's a good example to me. I don't know, what do you think, Monty?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely resonate with that. And I think it also speaks to me of this appeal of the kind of regen identity, which I think, exactly as Kevin's saying, goes beyond our individual brands and whatever. Like, I think there's a kind of fundamental appeal of the idea of being a regen and that kind of protopian cultural identity that I think a lot of people resonate, like maybe even at quite a deep level of their meaning and purpose in life. It's kind of, I'm not super religious or spiritual, but kind of being a regen kind of feeds your soul a bit. And so hopefully that's a kind of narrative that many different people can get behind, feel that shared sense of kinship with other regens, and want to participate in kind of larger coordination, organizational structures that help to kind of further that identity. And I think for me, the particular exciting bit about the network nation concept is I think there's been, a long history of alternative movements and change makers and communities from like eco villages, but, so often living on the fringes and isolated and fragmented. And, if we're really going to exert, I guess, more geopolitical power and interface with institutions and really create the change that we need, like how do we connect up all those isolated efforts and have a more coordinated kind of body to really enact the change that we want to see in the world as regens, I guess. So yeah, that's what's resonates with me.
Yeah, I guess I would say like this idea that like in like a kind of like root principle or the sort of like spiritual alignment of regens or regeneration being this idea that as you participate and contribute to something, you make the system ever more capable of supporting others. So you capacitate the system to be able to keep generating new things, not pulling from it, like extracting from it or mining it, but bringing more agency into the system that you're operating within so that it can support others. I feel like that's sort of this like core ethos of regeneration that can work in finance. It can work in like other forms of like law and tech. I think like an interesting example with network nations, particularly with the regen, is because it really does straddle two significant sort of paradigms, I think, at the same time right now. Like there's a really big, the mimetic power of bioregionalism is really significant right now. And it's been around for a long time, but it's like really having a go, which is great. And at the same time, the sort of like overthrowing the network state, the like evolution of Balaji's concept into thinking about like, borderless communities in the idea of network nations is also like really urgent and important, and it makes sense. And I feel like the kind of regen coordination world is the thing that's holding those two worlds together. Like we're all together in a networked form, and people who are like having this sort of renaissance of place-based bioregional approach. And so I think like the regen movement in particular, and like folks on this podcast are holding both of those worlds at the same time, and like not letting it be just the digital world or just the place or like the bioregional planetary. Like we're weaving those two movements together in an active way. And so that makes this sort of like hybrid creature that I think is really cool and introduces weird frictions and all sorts of stuff. But it's like a lot of bridge building thinkers and practitioners. And I'm stoked about that.
So the task with this episode is to try and understand whether these regions are coalescing around something that is a proto network nation, and then how we can actually move more towards the network nation approach. And one important thing, like, so we have this important distinction that we usually use to demarcate what is a proto network nation, what is just an online community or a movement or things like this, is like what is at the service of whom. And so on the one hand, we have like environmental activist groups which coalesce as a community because they have this objective, and the objective is we want to preserve a particular natural resources or promote particular activities or block other activities, right? So we have like an objective, a goal, and then a community is then coalescing together and doing collective action because there is this goal. And so in this case, the community is at the service of an objective which is external to the community and which justify the emergence of this community. And so this is like common. We know those models quite well. This is like all activist community or whatever. Now there is another way, which is where the community is actually designed for itself, right? So, and sometimes the community does collective action, but the collective action of the community is in order to foster the community and in order to foster the societal vision that this community has. But the goal of the community is actually to be a community, as opposed to be an instrument in order to achieve a particular goal. Even though, of course, because the community is a community, it has its own functions and its own desire of collective action. So I'm saying this to distinguish what will qualify as a standard environmental community, which is acting together towards something, and something else which is really like recognizing that there is shared values, shared aspiration, and therefore a sense, this weird sense of like community building because we of the same kind, right? And this is where like we are regions as opposed to we are participating into a movement for something. And so I would love like if you could elaborate according to you, like where are we in this regen community? Is it something that is coming together because there is some things that needs to be done and therefore we need a community, or is it more of a community driven endeavor in which people are finding each other because they share similar values and they feel some kinship towards each other, and therefore eventually decide to act together as a collective entity?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here because I think we had this conversation Primavera in Stockholm, and it was particularly resonant for me because it kind of got me thinking around ReFi DAO, and kind of reframing that thinking of, yes, actually, is ReFi DAO a network nation? Because it is quite focused around that specific ReFi cause of growing the ReFi movement. And is that enough of a kind of intrinsic kind of identity and cultural thing to justify it? And actually, that's when it kind of flipped into my head to say, actually, Regen is the network nation. That's the kind of shared cultural identity. You don't have to be in the Web3 space to identify as a regen. It really stretches across many different people and sectors that might look at that and go, hey, I really resonate with that kind of cultural identity. And so that for me feels like a much stronger cultural shelling point to bring this network nation structure together. And there isn't like a single objective of once, if we complete this objective, our mission is done kind of thing. Regen is more like an everlasting game, I guess, that you're playing or, identity that you're kind of playing out. So, yeah, for me,
So in your case, you will say, for instance, that ReFi DAO is a community, and
a
this
network
community,
society, we kind of call it,
network
and
society,
then but participating within
which is part of a larger network
the
nation.
larger
Yeah.
Regen Network Nation or Regen Nation or Regen Coordination or Regen Commons, whatever we want to call it.
To be defined. Yeah. What's the take of that or two?
I feel like there's probably some interesting difference here that's worth unpacking, because I think, and in some ways, there's some core questions and core challenges that I think the regen community is like really interested in, like exploring and like breaking down. Like Kevin introduced like coordination failures and like what are coordination tools around allocation and things like that. Like that's like almost like a first principle kind of like core question. And I feel like coordination failures, or the idea of like creating distributed frameworks by which we like sense and understand the state of the planet or of people and the planet, they're kind of like I feel like they're like mission-based problems that potentially new paradigms in technology and economics can really like not necessarily solve, but like can really evolve the problem space. And so I feel like the regen scene has a strong predilection for people who have discovered a particular like core set of like problems that they believe new models and like finance technology can do meaningful things to. And through that, communities form, there's common culture, there's common alignment. I think for myself, like I don't necessarily identify with like making a community per se. Like I see the community as an artifact, as an outcome of the sort of shared orientation towards exploring some like really core questions through these new stacks and new coordination, sensing, allocation tools and things like that. My sense is that the features of the regen space are like around like what's the question that like enchants you, or the problem space that you find enchanting that you want to like explore. And that if there's distinctions and the sort of cultural context or the different like communities, it's based off of like the sort of how they feel a strong conviction towards applying contemporary forms of technology and stuff to like these like core planetary questions. Yeah, so I think there's benefit to making it about the community, but I think I don't know how much I'm myself personally, like I feel like I'm doing it for the community so much as I'm like really in love with trying to explore some core questions through these emerging technologies with other people. So I think it's sort of like switching back and forth. I don't necessarily know if it's forming around the group of people or the group of people are forming around the mission, but I feel like there is this like core mission-driven set of questions that align and orient a lot of people in the space.
I feel like my definition of regen is like people always ask me to define regen. And I'm like, okay, well, like it's a little bit more of like a vibe than it is a hard and fast category. I think CoinDesk said that about the refi regen space. And I'm curious if you guys would push back on that. But one thing I will say is that, I speak computer science. I am a technologist from the beginning. And I feel like my definition of regeneration is more about like solving coordination failures and building systems that regenerate over time instead of degenerate over time. Whereas when I hang out with the Regen Network folks, it feels like it's a little bit more like earth forward or like earth first and ecological forward. And I'm wondering if we think that there's a tension between the earthy regen versus like more abstract like coordination failures regen, or are they both like both wings of the same phoenix?
Mm-hmm.
For me, not. I think I more define a regen as coming to something with trying to be a net positive impact on the world in whatever space you inhabit, trying to make things better actively in your kind of outlook. And I guess your unique talent is in the coordination space, and the Regen Network folks are deeply immersed in the kind of ecological regeneration side. But I think regeneration is inherently kind of expands many different kind of spaces, I guess. And that would be my take.
I think one interesting example that I like to use is like the example of Burning Man, because I think it really has this interesting collective identity where you go to Burning Man, you go maybe to a local burn, like you get into these places and you experience it for like 1 week or more, and then all of a sudden some people start identifying as I'm a burner, right? And you're still a citizen of many other things, but you're also a burner, and this becomes an actual identity recognition. And I think what's really interesting, and that's where I think it starts having the quality of a nation, is that if you meet another person which has no degree of, it's not your friend, it's not the friend of a friend or the friend of a friend of a friend, it's someone you have never met before that has no connection, but is also identifying with this cultural identity of a burner, all of a sudden, because we both associate as a burner, there is some kind of kinship that is felt, and therefore somehow a greater degree of solidarity, even though this is only justified from a cultural recognition of both being part of the same collective identity. And so I think the question with the regen is like, is kind of similar, I guess, but I'm curious on your opinion. Is like, if you meet a regen, that's like, it's just a regen, it's like I'm a regen, you don't have necessarily a link because of you are not necessarily part of the same communities. Do you actually feel a particular sense of kinship, or is just like you meet, like if I meet another French person in France, it's not that special. If I meet another French person when I'm maybe like on the other side of the planet, maybe I'm like, oh, you're French too. It's like there's something, and then we start chatting. But I wouldn't chat with just a random person. So there is this recognition of a common cultural background and a common cultural identity. So how does it resonate to you? Like, do you feel that the identity of being a region actually possess this nation-like feature of imagined community and resonance just because someone else also recognize themselves and have a shared cultural identity?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I could speak to my own personal experience of like wandering through some of these giant crypto conferences and feeling like a bit like lost, or like, is this really, what we're here for? And there's a lot of kind of, just kind of not resonant stuff that you might feel. And then, the particular example might be of in Denver, and then there was that really strong coming together of like the Regen Hub and all of that kind of stuff. And I think there was a really strong kind of resonance, certainly, around that community that kind of formed there. And kind of, I mean, and now it happens at all of the crypto conferences. There's a kind of Regen tribe that forms and does, side events and kind of, cross many projects and kind of space. So really, I certainly have experienced or feel that, but curious if others have as well.
Yeah, maybe I can reflect on that. And I love, Kevin, your question about like picking at that. I feel like that's a great space to occupy airwaves for this conversation. mean, I would say like the broader definition of regen is like I I don't surround myself with people who wouldn't identify with that kind of thinking. Like I don't want to hang out or like invest particularly a lot of time with people whose fundamental MO is like extractive or like not giving back into a supportive and like agency of like bringing energy. So there's like a base level of like trust and understanding that like we're like in the same boat and a common alignment that I think is like I can pick up on immediately, and maybe a person would identify as a regen or not. But that's a kind of just sort of just like a floor. It's like a floor to stand on. I think there's so many cultures and practices within that because it's a pretty big container. So yeah, it kind of depends. I think there's like thing to probe around the sort of vibe or sort of like, is it like ultimately a regenerative kind of thinking culturally or on a coordination level versus like, is it eco? That's like fun to talk about because there is like, that is sort of like, there are different camps and there are people who are like very eco and there are those who are more broad. They're saying like, well, social, cultural, financial regeneration exists in all these ways. And yeah, I feel like that is there's a sense of like maybe protection is the wrong word, but I feel like the sort of eco types, I don't think necessarily, or for myself, like I definitely sort of like I feel like I represent the sort of eco corner, but I don't think of myself of like chlorophyll and like drippy plants and stuff like that, like as what defines regeneration, but more like if you take this core principle to its logical conclusion, you can't not include the more than human world and like soil health and like the water cycle. So it's less like, am I environmentally oriented? It's like if I take the mandate that like people in the planet aren't separate from one another, then inevitably you start talking with language that is like borrowed from biology or ecology or environmental science. Cause it's like taking that idea as far as it can go means you're talking about like rights of rivers and stuff like that. So I feel like there isn't a like environmental, non-environmental distinction, but it's like how far do you take this principle down the rabbit hole? And that is an interesting sort of space of like, you know, how explicitly does it have to align around like planetary regeneration, like biosphere regeneration and stuff like that.
I feel like I'm expected to go next since I haven't spoken yet of the section, but if you want to just reorient me, Prima, around your prompt and what feels most present to talk about next, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, I mean, actually, I'm very curious about your opinion on this because you're actually the one that has explicitly started using the word nation for your community. So I assume that this, like, maybe it's just like as a joke, but like, was there an actual sense that using this terminology is also qualifying the community in a different manner than just an online community?
Yeah, great question. So I started calling the Green Pill Network a coordination, mostly as a shit post on top of Bankless, who would call their audience the Bankless Nation. But I do think that there's something that the word nation confers, which is sort of like a shared cultural identity and a shared enclosure in which you're funding your ecosystem's public goods, whether those are roads and bridges or an army. It depends on the nation and what the priorities are at the time. My favorite public good happens to be education these days. But yeah, so I mean, I think that there's an interesting sort of like formation of a shared cultural identity and set of priorities and governance that resources could be allocated to that we're sort of playing with there. And I think that that's sort of an interesting and provocative place to be because I don't think that there's a shared sense of like we're not all internet citizens, or I don't think we all think of ourselves as citizens of Earth in the same way we think of ourselves as being citizens in the nation state. And maybe that's just like a Westphalian era way that people think. But the provocation, I think, for me is that now that a lot of our relationships are mimetic and online as opposed to geographic and local, is there a way that we could have a mimetically local sense of citizenship such that we're funding public goods or coordinating around coordination failures in shared niches? And then from there, I think that there's a really interesting opportunity to take the technology that's working on the mimetically local stuff, things like Gitcoin, things like public goods funding from Octet and Giveth and Gitcoin, and then apply them in the geographically local sense. And so I think that this could be a huge coordination upgrade for humanity if we're able to do it. And part of playing with the idea of this being a nation instead of just like a gaggle of people in a DAO is that it confers citizenship and membership and shared cultural identity and that sort of like enclosure of public goods funding. And maybe that's what I kind of like fell ass backwards into by shit posting about it. But I'll just end by saying the most tangible example of this for me is the Ethereum localism rounds that I'm working on with Monty, where we're actually doing work in order to use Ethereum to make your local school and community and government and civic better. And I think that that's an interesting cosmolocal example of sort of playing with using this technology in a more like nation centric, like civic minded way. And so this isn't just theory. This is something that we're practicing and actively trying to iterate and evolve on. But you know, I'm more attached to that momentum and showing progress in that momentum than I am specifically around the frame of nation. And you know, I think that a nation like there's maybe I'll just end on that and just say that like I'm really interested in momentum and showing the impact reports, and then I think the memes will come as it starts to evolve and blossom into whatever it is.
Mhm. The memes always follow. Cool. So yeah, in fact, like I think another reason that the three of you are on this podcast is because you know, while we are trying to identify what is this thing that we are recognizing as regions, you are already in some way taking steps, like in practice, to somehow like interconnect, right? To move away from just being one community that does its own thing into recognizing that interconnection might be valuable and like trying to draw links amongst each other. So would you like to actually describe like what are the steps that you have been taking already and what is the aspiration of like creating more of an interwoven network amongst those different initiatives?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to this. Or unless, Kevin, you wanted to go first.
I was coming off mute to say Monty should speak to this.
All
Go.
right. Nice. Yeah. Well, I think for me, it really resonated because, you know, I was building ReFi DAO, but at the same time seeing Greenpill, BioFi, Bloom, these other kind of Cosmo local Web3 regeneration networks, and really thinking, you know, we're doing a lot of the same great things here. And I really resonate with those communities as well. And instead of building in our isolated kind of camps and competitive with each other, how do we build more structures where we're coordinating better and developing shared resources and public goods that benefit all of us? And luckily, I think blockchain provides some good affordances to kind of align those incentives and stuff as well. So yeah, that was really kind of the underlying thinking around, you know, starting this regen coordination. Started initially really with a kind of deep alignment with ReFi DAO and Greenpill, but also very much engaging with some of these other networks as well. And so that's been an interesting journey to go on. Obviously, we've developed various tools and public goods, but also run, you know, shared funding rounds together. But I think, you know, the kind of initial structures that we've developed are quite like, you know, relatively, you know, basic, rudimentary, you know, kind of a council with representation from each of the of the member networks. But I think what's really exciting and starting to merge is this kind of next evolution of DAO governance, which is really this shift, or I'm seeing it as a kind of shift from maybe, you know, the token-based membership kind of DAO structures to this network-first approach. And you know, we're working on this with Jake and Benjamin from Open Civics and others to kind of create this web of trust where really you can attest to other people's expertise, skills, and that gives them automatically a kind of a governance role in that network if they choose to express that and participate in that, which I think also has interesting parallels to how you get citizenship. Like in a nation, you kind of don't really apply to be a citizen of a nation. You're just born somewhere and you have the rights of a citizen. And so like, rather than us having to join DAOs and go through a membership structure, like, wouldn't it be cool if we were all just attesting to each other? And then suddenly that kind of gives you a sense of network identity and reputation and governance and participation within these structures that we're building. And so, yeah, this Regen Commons movement has been really exciting to see that emerge from kind of ETH Denver and Regen Network, and kind of putting their Regen Trainbark into a commons and then trying to form this kind of network-based governance structure to govern that and other common pool resources and assets for the Regen movement. So yeah, I'm super excited to see that as the kind of next evolution of our coordination network nation as the Regen movement.
Yeah, I think there's like Monty's pointing out some interesting things, and I'm totally in agreement. The opportunity, I mean, I think ETH Denver last year was an interesting point because it was sort of like uh, a moment when a particular culture like came up against how it was interpreted by sort of the masses or by the larger like ETH Denver community. And so coming together to like establish a sort of shared identity in distinction from how people might have interpreted how the word region could be used is really like powerful and helpful. Because there's such a strong anchoring of just the phrase regen within the space, the sort of like identity or the integrity of the phrase, I feel like is a common gravity well that aligns a lot of people of wanting to maintain its integrity. And as much as like, you know, terms can be trademarks or like specifications, like speech acts, like specifications of a particular kind of way of being. Like, I think the question of like what is and isn't regen is like a kind of core question. So yeah, like in the spirit of collaboration monsters, or like how is there sort of like a question around like governing collective alignment around the term and its fair use, without like squatting on a trademark or like resorting to more trad modes of intellectual property is like, I think, an interesting galvanizing force within the larger space. Yeah, and that was really sort of accelerated in the earlier part of this year, which was exciting. And that to me, like in some call it the Regen Commons or how it relates to the Regen coordination, I feel pretty like I have a hard time knowing which word to say because I like don't because there's just so many of them. So I just like don't say the word. And I'd love to be able to land on one that isn't like a politicized phrase.
Is
And
this
I just like,
polycentrism? This is
yeah,
polycentrism, though,
it's
in a way.
in action. Yeah, yeah. So in each sentence, I'll choose a
Yep.
different center. Um, but
Yeah, I think
that
future
movement's been called
future
like Regen Commons,
I
particularly.
would say feature not bug when it comes to
Yeah.
like lily padding across these things as sharing spaces. And it's really fun for me to sort of weave in and out of these spaces that are very like collectivist and like about the mission and not about any specific container. I wish that the rest of the world was like that. It's really a sigh of relief for me to have like no ego between the Regen network and then ReFi coordination and then Ethereum localism and then Gitcoin and greenpill. Like I really feel like I start to feel the DAO of DAOs coming into being, if not like on chain, but mimetically in the way that we're coordinating with each other. And a way to make it stronger, I think, would be like to the extent that we each have sustainable business models, which I think is questionable at this point, like doing token swaps with each other and then having them like economically forming a mesh network of coordination would be really interesting to me. And it's almost like there's a biomimetic thing in my mind here as I talk about this, which is like, how a group of cells become tissue and then become an organ together by interweaving so well. And I think that there's maybe something analogous that could happen with this DAO of DAOs that we're playing with here, where my framework for a DAO to DAO partnership is like social and then technological and then economic interdependencies. And so I think that we're like, you start with the social, like, do I want to have a beer with this person? Do I want to vibe with them? And then you start to integrate each other's technologies, which we're sort of starting to do in a few ways. And then like the last step is economically interoperating with each other. And then that's just like the one-to-one example, but imagine the many to many sort of coordination that evolves when each of these things are interoperated with each other. And then so we have shared incentives around the mission instead of any one container. So that's sort of like how I think this is going to evolve, or at least I would like to antagonize it to evolve in the future.
Yeah, there's an excellent point, and this is actually like this is exactly what we are trying to like theorize, but entanglement. So like I feel like you're already doing entanglement, and we're actually studying what you're doing in order to theorize the entanglement. I will add one additional one to your list, which is a perfectly ordered list. I think the last step is actually structural. Right, it's like first you need to like vibe with people and like, oh, kinship, it's like, oh, there is this feeling of like we're a nation, and then you start creating technology in order to facilitate commoning, like putting resources together, collective governance of those resources, etc. And then you have like economic entanglement, which is great, but it's still economic. You can still rage quit, And I think the last step, which is obviously like that's when you become texture and you cannot identify the distinction of the cell because they're entangled with one another, is when like structurally there starts to be like melting into each other. Like you're actually sharing your blood as opposed to just sharing economics or mutualizing resources. And I think the most obvious thing, in fact, in when you think about like in the corporate sector, structural entanglement will be like exchanging of stocks, right? And so now I have an incentive that you do well, and you have an incentive. So there's like it's economic and it's structural because you're literally owning each other. And so in the context of the region, this is I think is an interesting question to explore. Is like if we try to think about actually moving to the last step of structural entanglement, what would that look like?
So, I mean, I think if the prompt is what would structural entanglement look like, then I think that like the two priors that come to mind for me are how did traditional nations work and how are they structured? And then there's also nature, which has its own sort of like structured, I think that evolved a little bit more emergently over time. And so you can start to reason about like what are the institutions in mainstream society. I think those are the structural entanglements that we all rely on, and we're probably not even aware of them. Think institutions like the Fed and schools and community centers and churches and stuff like that. To me, you feel like the structural entanglements in traditional society. Whereas the structural entanglements in nature, that feels like it has a heavily overlap with keystone species, which is actually something that your partner Gregory Landau taught me. Basically, keystone species are species upon which all other species in an ecosystem rely. So basically, like mycelial networks is a keystone species. I guess humans are a keystone species in a way because
This
we
is
have,
kind of the argument that humans
yeah.
are the keystone species too.
And but are we a cancer also from the point of view of the
Like
planet?
we're
Like that's
bug.
another question. But like I guess like Primo, how would you feel if I volleyed back to you if the question was what are the structural entanglements? Like I guess first starting by looking at what structural entanglements look like in human society and in nature, and then using that to reason about what a Web3 structural entanglement could look like.
Yes, actually, so we discussed this in our last workshop, and in some way, like in the human society, our structural entanglement is when we like it's like legal structure and reproduction. So when you create family, you're structurally entangled at you just become one unit, right? And then when I create like a company with people, I'm also structurally entanglement through this structural thing. Now we are all into the same boat, right? It's like so it's creating those structures which are such that it's actually become undesirable. Like I cannot rage quit anymore. You can always divorce, but it's like very, very tedious process because the structure is so strongly incentivizing you to stay together. So we create, I would say like in human society is like legally done, right? Like we create those legal contraption, which are such that there is such a strong incentive in collaborating together in order to make something happen that benefits everyone. That the concept of like the tragedy of the commons or the concept of rage quitting makes no sense because we are so structurally embedded into the structure that it's so costly to leave that we would rather try and collaborate in order to make sure that this works well, right? And I feel like the blockchain space has some degree of like structural entanglement with like if I'm part of a DAO, but those are oftentimes like a little bit too weak because of the rage quit or because of like you can always leave and then take your funds and run. So how do we actually increase the entanglement to a point in which it actually becomes more desirable to collaborate than to exit?
Yeah, I like that. I think maybe part of it is this reputation system that we're kind of building up because that can be a soul-bound reputation, right? And if you rage quit or do something that's defecting against the group and they negatively attest to you, maybe that is brought across, influences your position across the entire space that you're operating in and influences your financial and economic opportunities. And whereas if you do positive sum collaborations, you're going to continually get positive attestations from other people that you're kind of in that community with, and it's going to level you up in multiple ways. And so maybe that is as a mechanism of kind of positive sum entanglement that we could be
Yeah, I
looking.
think that's a great point. Like as you accumulate a lot of like reputation and attestation, it becomes very incentivized for you to continue to make sure that this system flourish because you're gonna flourish with it, right?
So maybe that's Gitcoin 3.0.
Like if the way that you form a collective identity with one another means that it's like like the shared structure, the shared framework is the store of like your agency within that space, like your good reputation, then there's a fundamental incentive to keep that like larger frame intact, or to like be stuck in its stickiness because it's enabling and like bringing about your
Exactly.
ability to do further things.
Yeah, I think you said it very well. I think it's like the structural entanglement is when you create a structure which gives you more agency, and collectively the people that are part of the structure benefit from this additional agency, and so you act towards the flourishing of the structure, and then everyone benefit from that, and everyone is actually acting towards the benefit of the structure.
Yeah, and maybe it gets even stronger when we kind of reach out to say, you could even be living physically in some of these regen communities. TDF, Traditional Dream Factory, comes to mind, and these other communities across the globe that are actually co-living, and also then part of these kind of more global regen, structures and network nations. And if you defect from that, that's literally where you're living. So you could be, turfed out of your living space, which is obviously quite a strong, if you're literally socially entangled with the people that you're living with on the ground, and especially as we head towards a quite scary potential civilization collapse type moment. I think the value of the networks and the friendships and relationships and the reputation, etc., that you've built up in those networks is going to become extremely valuable. And so, yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of extension of that, kind of with parallels to normal nations, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Like living on the same territory is obviously one of the strongest structural entanglement, because if something goes wrong in that territory, everyone is suffering the same. So everyone wants to preserve the territory. Okay, last question that I want to ask everyone is so if we recognize this thing as this Regen Network Nation, what do you think is the low-hanging fruit of like what's the easiest or most expedite way to actually move a little bit more forward the formation of this thing as a network nation? I mean, you guys are already doing it, but like given the state that we did that, what do you think is the next step?
I want to get capital flowing. It feels like it's all just fluff until we're like sending money to each other and then proving back with impact certificates a proof of impact, and starting to spin this flywheel of delivering money to the network and proving that the impact happened. That's the most important governance function I think that nations have. And by the way, this is all just a Trojan horse to shill Gitcoin 3.0 and the GG24 work that we're doing together, because we're actually going to distribute at least 100, 200K into Ethereum localism and across sort of like regen causes. Monty, I don't know, you can correct me on that or speak more. I think you're closer to that than I am. But yeah, it feels like actually getting money flowing to these causes in a cosmo-local way is the way to go.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. And I think, I guess one sort of challenge, I guess, for network nations is that, network states have a really great model of raising money, maybe unpopular, but involuntary taxation of your wealth is a great way to raise lots of money. And it probably is going to be more challenging for network nations to continue, to raise that capital. Maybe there's kind of tithing, but, that's voluntary. How successful is that going to be? We'll find out. But I think what is exciting is working with Kevin and others to try and, unlock those capital raising structures where we're kind of bringing together many sources of capital, matching on matching. And from, the Ethereum localism side, are those local communities partnering with local municipalities, sponsors, NGOs, etc., and then matching that with the various sources of crypto capital we can kind of pull together. And then how we're creating those kind of feedback loops that it's then replenishing the blockchain treasuries and other kind of these, we're all operating on the same economic infrastructure. And hopefully that creates some of the feedback loops where we can kind of sustain the funding of the activities. So yeah, super excited to see all that continue to emerge.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question with the low hanging fruit. I feel like because it's such a big space, like the differentiation into like organs that create a collective body is like kind of coming to mind here, and like the capacity for coordination and allocation through Gitcoin, or the kind of identity and reputation system that Monty's talking about, or like a sense and impact attestation system that Regen Network's been working on. Like how like coming up with a very humble exercise that like links these like three elemental forms together to route capital, and like Kevin introduced, makes a ton of sense and is super interesting. the like celebrating that there's like areas of focus within each one of the organizations that can then contribute to the other one, I think is like
Mm.
not having to say that we're all the same, but being stoked about the differentiation as a way of creating collective emergent capacity is what's really getting me excited during this conversation. Um, because yeah, there's basically at stake, there's like what feels like an enormous amount of capital that's ungrounded and seeking a way to the ground in some core ways that like are requiring the stacks that folks on this podcast are collectively building to meaningfully route itself with integrity to different places. So like proving that there's a pipeline and a readiness by organizations who receive funding to not have that be divisive, but to be capacity building in like small ways so that it can scale up to larger and larger is, I feel like, the sort of procession that's unfolding here. Like that's the walk that we're trying to explore.
One question, or maybe a provocation I have for you, Primavera, is we're kind of discussing proto network nation, and I'm curious, I guess, for you, what defines reaching that, network nation status? And I guess network states have a really clear endpoint. It's like they get diplomatic sovereignty and recognition from other nation states, and then they're a network nation. But like, what's the network nation version of that, where you'd come back to us in a year's time and go, hey, you guys are no longer a proto anymore?
um, it's a very good question. I think it's like it's not it stays a lot of axes, I guess, and like everyone is emergent on a few of those axes. I guess there is a point, you don't know exactly which point in which there is a state change. It's like, I guess it's like when there is diplomatic recognition by other network nation, which means like when people recognize themselves as part of the Regen Network and the Regen Network is recognized by others as its own entity. I think that will be like, so it has like it has the social and the cultural, like self-perception and external perception. And I guess it's like capacity of collective action in the name of, right? It's like right now, I think there is all those nodes, all those communities that are acting as a collaborative network, which is great, but you can still tell, okay, this is this node and this node doing something together and this one doing something with that one. And I think there is a point in which that texture is so well interwoven that people just don't say this is ReFi DAO or this is like Greenpill or Regen Network. They just say this is the Regen Network Nation, because it becomes difficult to. So
Yeah,
I
I mean,
guess
like,
the answer will be the moment in which it's too hard to tell which node is what, because you can still recognize the constitutive part, but the actions are all interwoven by so many actors, then I guess it becomes too complex to list them, and so you just say network nation, Regen.
yeah, like a micro example of that already happening is we had the kind of ReFi Pangan in Thailand nodes that also had Greenpill node at chapter, and then they were like, well, we're not running these separate organizations, and then they're like, bring them together. It's like, we don't want to have like
Yeah,
10 different nodes all run by the same people, the same place, and actually just all merge together. It's the Regen, identity
exactly.
that is the meta.
Or it's sort of like, I honestly don't know what word to use to describe the collective thing. Like when it's like, oh, there isn't an obvious default like reference for the proper noun of Regen coordination or Regen commons or Greenpill. Like I'm not sure what to say. Like the word just slipping away from me, I feel like is a healthy indicator of like, right, those nominations are slipping away into like this core understanding of alignment. So it's like pick your phrase in a way is a healthy sign to me.
Yeah, I
like
agree.
that.
I think it's a very beautiful, Kevin, you said it, it's a very beautiful sign of proper polycentricity. Okay, cool. We're at the hour, so last chance for each one of you, if you can give your last word, whatever you want it to be, and also let everyone know how they can connect with you and your initiative.
I feel like my last word, I'm taking this as a provocation for it to be last word. My last word is protopia. We're not pushing for a utopia, some far off distant future that we all have to have faith in some benevolent leader in order to get there. Trust me, we're going to get to utopia. No, we're building a protopia, which means that every quarter is better than the last quarter. Every month is better than the last month. every year is better than the last, iterating and evolving. And that's what, to me, I feel like that's my last word, is protopia. So the way it looks in September 2025, which is when we're recording this podcast, is going to iterate and evolve every month, every quarter between now and whenever we eventually realize your vision, Primo, or we iterate and evolve on the vision from there. So for me, this is all about building protopia. And I would ask that you don't trust any leader that's telling you that they're bringing you to a utopian place. Trust yourself, trust the visible signs of progress around you, and sense make with the people around you about the direction they go, and iterate, evolve towards creating a regen coordination or regen commons or a network nation or whatever you think that your goal is. But I think that protopia is increasingly the way that I'm thinking. So that's my last word.
Great word.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I think my last words would just be to question, like, what are we here to do in Web3 and crypto? Like, are we just here to pump the meme coins and speculate? Sure, it's fun, but like, yeah, I think we can do better, and hopefully we're here to actually build systems that genuinely solve real problems and serve all life on Earth. So that's my provocation to any Web3 builders in listening to this podcast. Join the regens.
Yeah, I guess my invitation is, like, I feel like there's a ton of low-hanging fruit in front of us that if we can symbolically demonstrate like other futures, other present tenses to be possible, like a lot of resourcing and momentum can get behind it. So I feel very excited by the fact that if we can like wire up more proofs of concept of resources and like capacity flowing in this way, like that there's a lot of momentum that can grow from that. I feel like we should just, and if y'all are in NYC for Climate Week, I feel like we should just hang out. It's kind of like one of my last things, like, let's be friends and hang out. And
Regen House in Argentina, Edge City. Let's go.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. That was cool.
yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Prima. Appreciate you hosting. Looking forward to the rest of the season, and looking forward to working with everyone on this panel in building this vision together.
Looking forward to the developments.
Cool. Appreciate y'all.
Yeah, we'll check back in a year's time, see how the Regen Nation's doing.
Yeah,
whether we can,
that'd be cool.
Yeah, Network Nation status unlocked.
After I spike the ball in Protopia, it better be better than it is now. We'll see. All right, invite us back in a year. Thanks, Prima. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.